When Louis XIV died in September 1715, he left France with debts most contemporaries estimated at roughly 3 billion livres, against annual revenues of perhaps 150 million. Historians, including Antoine Murphy, in his 1997 Oxford University Press biography of John Law, described the French treasury as functionally insolvent. Tax revenues were pledged years in advance. The new regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, faced immediate default unless he found a structural solution. Partial repudiation was tried. A visa chamber canceled or reduced some debts, inflicting losses on creditors. That proved insufficient, and conventional borrowing at sustainable rates was unavailable to a government that had already broken faith with lenders. John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671 to a family of goldsmiths and bankers, which gave him early exposure to credit and money. In 1694, he killed a man named Edward Wilson in a London duel, was convicted of murder, escaped from prison, and spent the next 2 decades as a professional gambler and monetary theorist moving through European courts. He was not merely a schemer. His 1705 pamphlet Money and Trade Considered argued that the scarcity of gold constrained commerce and that a land-backed paper currency could expand the money supply without the deflationary squeeze of metal. Most European governments rejected the idea. France, desperate and out of options, eventually listened. In May 1716, Law received a royal charter to open the Banque Générale Privée, a private bank with the right to issue paper notes. Crucially, the regent decreed that the bank's notes would be accepted in payment of taxes. That single concession gave the notes a floor of legitimacy. Because they could settle obligations to the crown, they circulated. The bank operated on partial reserve principles, and in its early years it functioned soundly enough that note holders could convert them to specie on demand. Merchant confidence grew. Law used this early success to argue for a far more ambitious project. In August 1717, Law obtained a charter for the Compagnie d'Occident, soon known as the Mississippi Company, which was granted monopoly rights to develop and trade with French Louisiana, a vast and largely unmapped territory in North America. The Crown's promotional literature described Louisiana as rich in gold and silver, claims that were almost entirely unsupported by actual surveys or settlements. Law then systematically absorbed additional monopolies, taking over the East Indies Company, the China Company, and other royal trading franchises, eventually creating the Compagnie des Indes in 1719. By that point, the merged company held a monopoly over virtually all French overseas trade and the right to collect certain royal taxes, making it, on paper, one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in history. In December 1718, the regent converted the Banque Générale into the Banque Royale, a state institution whose notes now carried a royal guarantee. This removed the remaining constraint on note issuance. The original private bank had been limited by its own capital, but the Banque Royale could, in principle, issue as many notes as the crown wished. Law used this capacity to fund successive share offerings in the Mississippi Company. New shares were offered at prices above the prevailing market rate, and investors could buy them using notes issued by the very bank Law controlled. The resulting circle was self-reinforcing. More notes supported higher share prices, which attracted more investors, who demanded more notes. According to the Wikipedia article on the Mississippi Bubble and several financial historians, shares in the Compagnie des Indes rose from around 500 livres in mid-1719 to prices historians estimate peaked near 18,000 livres in January 1720. The Rue Quincampoix in Paris, where shares were traded in the open air, became so congested that contemporary accounts describe fistfights breaking out and, in one often cited anecdote, a hunchback renting out his back as a writing desk for contract signers. The French language acquired the word millionaire during this period, coined for those who had turned paper profits into landed estates and carriages. Law himself became Comptroller General of Finances in January 1720, the most powerful financial official in France. The mechanism that inflated share prices also inflated everything else. As the Banque Royale expanded its note issuance to support successive share tranches, more money circulated in the French economy without a corresponding increase in goods and services. Antoine Murphy's research on Law's monetary experiment documents a sharp rise in French price levels through 1719 and into 1720. Rents in Paris reportedly doubled. The purchasing power of the very notes Law had issued began to erode, which created a dangerous incentive: hold shares, not paper. That rush further inflated the share price in the short term, but meant that when confidence broke, holders would try to exit both paper money and shares simultaneously. The first public crack came in early 1720. The Prince de Conti, a powerful nobleman who had been snubbed by Law, sent wagons to the Banque Royale demanding conversion of his notes into gold specie. Law persuaded the regent to force the prince to return most of the coin, but the episode was widely observed. It signaled that convertibility might be refused. To slow the outflow of gold and stabilize share prices, Law in February and March 1720 issued a series of edicts that progressively limited the amount of gold individuals could legally hold and gradually reduced the stated face value of both shares and notes. The edicts were quickly reversed under public pressure, but the reversal itself broadcast official panic to a market already running on confidence. By May 1720, bank runs had become unmanageable. A crowd attempting to redeem notes at a Paris branch was caught in a crush that, according to contemporary accounts cited by historian Janet Gleason in her biography of law, resulted in multiple deaths from trampling. Convertibility was formally suspended. Shares in the Compagnie des Indes fell as fast as they had risen. Efforts to stabilize the system by fusing shares and notes into a single instrument failed. By the end of 1720, shares that had traded near 18,000 livres in January had fallen to prices far below their 500 livre starting point, according to sources cited in Murphy's Oxford biography, and trading effectively ceased. John Law resigned as Comptroller General in May 1720 and fled France in December of that year, reportedly aided by the regent who owed him the courtesy of an exit. He spent his remaining years moving between Brussels, Venice, and other European cities, never recovering his fortune. He died in Venice in March 1729 with, by most accounts, modest assets remaining. France faced a reckoning. The collapse left holders of Bank Royale notes and Mississippi shares with paper worth a fraction of what they had paid. A government commission called the Visa spent years adjudicating claims, restoring some obligations, and extinguishing others. The total losses remain difficult to quantify precisely, but they fell heavily on the middle class and many nobles who had converted real property into paper. Many historians argue that the trauma of Law's system produced a lasting scar on French financial culture. France did not establish a functioning central bank again until Napoleon founded the Banque de France in 1800, 80 years after the collapse. Where Britain's contemporaneous South Sea bubble, equally devastating in its immediate effects, was followed within decades by the consolidation of the Bank of England as a credible institution, France's equivalent moment ended in a broad repudiation of paper money backed by government confidence. Charles Kindleberger in Manias, Panics, and Crashes argues this gap delayed French capital market development relative to Britain for much of the 18th century. This is a contested interpretation, but it is a prominent one in the literature on financial history. John Law's system illustrates a structural problem that recurs across financial history. What happens when the entity that controls the money supply also has a direct financial interest in a particular asset price? Law did not set out to defraud anyone. He was a genuine monetary theorist who believed paper money could unlock economic growth, and the early years of his bank supported that belief. The mechanism that destroyed the system was a conflict of interest built into its architecture. The bank printed notes, the notes bought shares, and the man running both had every incentive to print more. Modern economies address this by separating central banks from fiscal and commercial operations and requiring central bank independence. None of those guardrails existed in France in 1719, which is in part why this story ended the way it did. Observing how those institutional separations were built and what happens when they erode is part of understanding how monetary systems function.